Thanks so much, Roger. And thanks for having me as a guest presenter for TASA Thursdays. My name's Hannah Klose and I'm a PhD candidate at Monash University. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm tuning into this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I also recognise the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work and are tuning in from today, and also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. And I just wanted to also do a quick trigger warning, as well, as a lot of this content is related to gender-based violence. So if you need to tune out or, remove yourself, then please ensure you do so. So it is really great to be able to share with you some of the key findings from my thesis, which is entitled Just Get Offline, Girls and Young Women's Experiences of Online Gender-Based Violence in Australia. So that quote there, just get offline, is actually one of the quotes from my interview participants who was talking about how girls and young women have been told this same advice time and time again, where they've experienced abuse on social media and they've just been told to withdraw from technology or delete their accounts to stop the harm. But we do need to keep in mind that this type of advice reflects broader and also pretty harmful attitudes towards gendered violence, where girls and young women are essentially responsible for the harm that they experience. And personally, I've been told the same thing too. And I think it really puts it back on the victim rather than the person who's actually perpetrating the abuse. And of course, because it takes place online, these experiences can be, severely minimized, and there's often limited accountability as well for the perpetrators. So it is likely that this will keep happening again unless holistic interventions are put in place. So I'm just going to give a bit of an overview for today. So in this presentation, I'll highlight why I am conducting my research and also why I believe it is an emerging issue that needs to be addressed also in an Australian context. I'll then go over my methodology for my project, including what phases of my research were involved. And in terms of my data, I'll also be providing just a summary of the most common experiences of online gender-based violence, so the experiences that were shared with me. And I'll also look at the impacts of these harms as well, because these were key themes that I discussed in my first two data chapters of my thesis. And it's kind of exciting, but also a bit daunting. I'm in the final 6 months before I do submit my thesis, so I will be sharing the findings from my final data chapter 2, which I've just finished writing up. And so this data chapter draws on insights from interview participants and then also survey respondents to develop best practices for addressing online gender-based violence. And after presenting these findings, I'll also identify how this research can effectively translate into real-world interventions and also policy recommendations. So I guess the goal here is to kind of bridge that gap between academic research and then practical application. And at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has as well. So firstly, I think it'd be helpful to explain what I mean when I use the term online gender-based violence. So it does refer to a range of harmful behaviours against girls, women, and also gender diverse people. And these are primarily perpetrated through technology. But for the purposes of my study and because of the vast landscape of polymedia, I've just limited it to social media platforms. And I know that the language and the terminology that's used to capture this type of violence, it does differ between different projects and different researchers, but I'm using online gender-based violence as an umbrella term because it refers to a spectrum of harmful online behaviours. So there are some examples. So threatening messages, trolling, online misogyny, hate speech, gendered harassment, unwanted messaging, electronic aggression, like the list goes on. But unfortunately, these terms are only, they're only a partial representation of online gender-based violence. So in my research, I wanted to encourage participants to kind of guide the discussion of their experiences. And I didn't want to use like predetermined categories or just, one or two types of violence, because that might have limited the contexts in which their experiences occurred. So I believe having this kind of approach helped me gain a more holistic understanding of how they navigate the online world and also the harms that they experience in these spaces. And then also ways in which we can improve the existing policy frameworks and legal responses to online gender-based violence. So I guess when I first started my PhD, I was pretty naive in thinking I could cover, all online expressions of misogyny, patriarchy, gender inequality, just within the scope of a single thesis. And unfortunately, the landscape of gendered abuse on social media is just too broad. When I first started my PhD too, I was also under the impression that girls and young women's experiences of online gender-based violence can be easily identified, explained, and addressed. And, that's just not the case. And in some circumstances, this is what I found in my research, some of the girls and young women didn't even know that they were experiencing online gender-based violence, probably because they thought it wasn't serious or severe enough, and also because it took place online, so they weren't actually experiencing this face-to-face. But I guess the whole point of my thesis is to give girls and young women the chance to share their experiences and somehow give them a voice and empower them to use social media on their own terms. And then obviously develop some key recommendations that inform platform design and policies. So these kind of key points or these aims are linked to my research questions too. So for this reason, I've endeavored to, like I said, give young women and girls a voice by providing critical insight into how they identify the nature and extent of these harms and how we should be addressing online gender-based violence as well. Okay, I think I should provide just a bit of a background on my study in terms of my methodology. So there were two key research phases. So phase one involved interviews with stakeholders across Australia. So this was with 15 practitioners, academics, and industry professionals that were working in the field of gendered violence prevention and also digital criminology too. So there was that tech aspect, which I think was essential for this research. And these interviews took place at the end of 2021. They were all conducted on Zoom because I think we're in the midst of like another lockdown. So this was essential. And then phase two was a short online survey. And so that was initiated through Qualtrics. This survey was catered for the young women living in Australia who had experienced online gender-based violence directly. And I made the age category between 18 and 25 years, as I found previous research found, this was the most common age demographic where people had experienced the most type of online gender-based violence. So that's why I kind of limited to that age category. So I guess when I distributed the survey, I was able to gather young women's personal experiences and see what recommendations they have to offer when addressing online gender-based violence. I gathered 40 responses from the young women who were willing to share their experiences with me. And I think a really interesting finding in my study is that sometimes the viewpoints from the victim survivors sometimes didn't fully align with what the interviewees had to say based on their own professional knowledge. So I think this tension between the interviewees' insights and also the survey respondents' experiences highlighted the continued importance of giving girls and young women a voice because they're the ones that have experienced online gender-based violence. And then it also shows that the lived experience does not always reflect the existing policy and support responses, as we've probably seen. So for my theoretical framework, I used Liz Kelly's Continuum of Sexual Violence to understand the extent, nature, and responses to online gender-based violence. And I thought this framework, I found it really helpful as it allowed me to explore the range of multiple recurring and interrelated forms of violence that are experienced by girls and women on social media. So Kelly herself highlights that the continuum does not rank each act of violence based on severity or seriousness. So it's not like a hierarchy where the most serious form of violence is at the top and then something like maybe online misogyny is at the bottom. Conceptualizing it like that in a hierarchy is pretty harmful. So Kelly suggests that, it should be a continuum that ranges from everyday forms of normalized abuse to the more criminalized acts. So I guess in line with this perspective, like I mentioned before, I did want my research to be guided by girls and young women's experiences. And I found that just focusing on a select type of online violence might actually fail to capture the different contexts in which online gender-based violence can occur. So you'll see on the slides there, I've got 4, I guess, key themes or the most common behaviors that emerged from my study. So that was sexual harassment, abusive and offensive language, monitoring threats and control, and then also image-based abuse, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So firstly, there is currently a lot of research that examines the prevalence of sexual harassment in a range of different contexts. So this could be sexual harassment in the workplace, on the street, in licensed venues, and in universities. But in a digital context, we can look at the impacts of sexual harassment in digital spaces or cyberspace, and pay attention to the specific aspects of online culture and technology that reinforce these harmful online behaviors. So in my study, some of the young women surveyed, they experienced a variety of unwanted sexual behaviors, as you can see in the quotes here. So one of the respondents, Isabella, recounted a time when she was sent an unsolicited image of a stranger's genitals through Snapchat. So she said, I had a random man add me on Snapchat when I first got it, and he immediately sent me sexually explicit images of himself. And she's referred to this as dick pics, as this is what it's colloquially referred to. She then said she blocked him immediately and restricted people from adding her without permission. So this is actually an important feature of Snapchat, which I also didn't realize until it happened to me too. So it allows you to, there's like a quick add function that Snapchat allows, where unknown people are easily able to add people on Snapchat and then send them unwanted images or messages as well. So basically, you know, your profile's on public, but you didn't know that in the first place. So you have to go out of your way and make sure that you're not opening your account up to random people. But this is obviously pretty problematic because this this platform guidance on privacy settings, it does place the onus and responsibility on girls and young women. So, you know, essentially they have to manage their own experiences of this so that they don't receive sexually explicit images. So you can see also in the second quote there, Miriam also had kind of like similar experiences, but this was where some older men were asking if they can be her sugar daddy. And yeah, another survey responded, highlighted at the bottom there, that Facebook Marketplace can actually be a breeding ground for men to make unsolicited comments about their appearance. So you can see here, people agreeing to purchase something after they have your address. And then after they say that, they say, it doesn't hurt that you're gorgeous too. So for Kylie, obviously these comments made her feel super uncomfortable, especially when they have her home address now. So she doesn't know what could happen potentially. So in terms of abusive and offensive language, which was another theme or main behavior that emerged from my research, there were survey respondents that described different ways in which abusive and offensive language had affected them. So for example, one of the survey respondents, Megan, she described her experiences of this behavior as creepy. So she explained that she's received offensive messages from people that she doesn't even know. And most of these are related to flirting or sharing intimate photos or creepy behavior such as knowing where I live or who I know and where they saw me. So similar to the previous experience where Kylie, you know, she experienced something where someone said, oh, it doesn't hurt that you're gorgeous too. I know where you live now. This is very similar because it illustrates the violation and disruption of user privacy, which obviously has the potential to facilitate experiences of online violence, but then this could potentially escalate into offline violence too. She said that this wasn't a common, like an uncommon experience among her and her female friends, and that they usually receive these type of messages via message requests on Facebook and Instagram. So similar to, I guess, the Snapchat function where people can just randomly add you. The same instance here, message requests is usually from random people that aren't your friends on Facebook or Instagram. And then you'll see in the in the bottom comments, so Caroline and Lena talked about this type of language and how it can manifest in the comments sections, especially on platforms like Instagram and TikTok. And this is particularly the case where women with large social media followings, so influencers, for example, they're commonly targeted. And people can see this, obviously, this is all public in a public forum. So it's quite easy to be able to identify that pretty quickly. So there are some scholars that have drawn on Liz Kelly's continuum of sexual violence, but they've used it to examine image-based abuse. So these harmful behaviors relate to the creation of digitally manipulated sexual images, deepfakes, upskirting, downblousing, sextortion, and images of sexual assault as well. And as you can see, these behaviors were also apparent in my study. So, for example, Abigail shared that a group of men had hacked into her friend's Facebook account, and they created some deepfake pornographic images and videos of her. So in Abigail's case, the perpetrators made threats to distribute this material in an attempt to coerce her into an unwanted act, such as paying money. So pretty much, yeah, blackmail. And then similarly, Jess described how she had been exposed to pornography through platforms such as Twitter and Tumblr. And these platforms, they don't have the best history in terms of, looking after girls and women on social media, on their platforms. And they're actually known to be kind of toxic spaces for them as well. So I guess regardless of whether or not the survey respondents felt like they were impacted by the behavior, it does seem plausible that image-based abuse is considerably more common and even kind of expected for girls and young women as well. So as I've identified, and it's pretty obvious, social media platforms, they do facilitate opportunities for perpetrators to monitor and also stalk their victims. So unfortunately, these behaviors can quickly escalate to threats of physical violence, which allows perpetrators to gain or maintain a sense of power and control. So, for example, Molly said that she's had anonymous threats made towards her, including that she should be raped to death. And sadly, this is consistent with the existing literature that says rape and death threats are the most prevalent forms of gender trolling. And in my study, you'll see on the left-hand side in the purple box, one of the survey respondents, Isabella, shared that her friend had actually been the victim of offline stalking, which began on LinkedIn. So what happened is the man had been able to locate her profile. I think they met when they were clubbing. He tracked her down on social media and proceeded to harass her even when she did not respond to his messages. And then Isabella's friend blocked the perpetrator, had to make her account on private just to prevent further experiences of harassment. But when she did this, he and his friends proceeded to stalk her in person. And then Maggie also shared a similar example where her friend received threatening messages for months from her ex-boss. And even though she told him to stop, he continued to threaten her. I should make the point, like, it's obviously these respondents didn't experience these harm directly, but it's also important to look at how online gender-based violence can be experienced vicariously, which can also normalize these behaviors too. And these two examples, they show that social media platforms provide opportunities for perpetrators to enhance their harmful and controlling behaviors, not just online, but also offline. Okay, so in terms of learning about how, I guess, girls and young women respond or contextualize their experiences of abuse, there were some protective strategies that emerged. So it was difficult to extract some direct quotes from the young women through a survey. So because of this, or instead of this, I asked them to select from a list of options on what they would do when they typically experience or witness online gender-based violence. So this included self-censorship and restricting social media use, directly blocking the perpetrator, reporting the abuse to platforms, and then also withdrawing from platforms altogether. And as you'll see in the next few slides, the interviewees were able to expand on some of these strategies, including reasons why girls and young women might employ these particular measures. So first of all, some of the participants highlighted that girls and young women can often anticipate the harms on social media because they've experienced them before. And this might lead them to self-censor because, they become a bit more wary of the content that they post and also the information that they make public on social media. So for example, you can see there, Robin has said, I think women can self-censor and not say things that they would like to because they're fearful of someone saying something that might make them feel unsafe. So her insight was also supported by what respondent Emily said about not wanting to share parts of her life because it just seems so stressful about what someone could respond to next. So I guess self-censoring in this context could also mean restricting what you post and then also increasing your privacy settings just to mitigate potential harm. And as my study found, self-censorship and increased privacy settings are very valid modes of self-protection. So the participants shared insights into their use of blocking mechanisms. I'm sure, everyone at some point has probably had to block someone, on social media. It's a very common form of protection. And some survey respondents said that, instead of reporting to the perpetrator to the platform, which they viewed as being too kind of extreme, they would just block them directly to stop them from abusing them further. So you can see there's already a pattern forming here. These protective strategies, I guess, are more like preventative strategies because girls and young women, they've had these experiences before, and now they're engaging in extra safety work to ensure it doesn't happen to them again, or that it happens less often at least. So you can see Isabella here, she said that blocking accounts via the platform is usually enough for her, but in saying that, she found that these blocking mechanisms weren't effective, especially if the perpetrator was using an anonymous profile. So these are called imposter accounts, which are usually just set up for the purposes of, harassing people, and then they can easily be deleted and easily replaced as well. So there's a lack of accountability. And a lot of the interview participants, they actually reflected on their own personal experiences, when they use social media and experienced abuse on these platforms. So I appreciated that they did feel comfortable enough to share this with me. For example, Harriet said that she's blocked a lot of people who have suddenly followed her, and then she notices that they're part of a men's rights group. So she knows that they're going to troll her at some point. So this is her preemptively blocking them because she knows she's going to cop abuse from them, basically. So once again, her account is an example of girls and young women being responsible for mitigating the harm that they could potentially experience on these platforms. So although most of the survey respondents generally knew how to access reporting mechanisms, what I found was that almost half of them, so 48%, were unfamiliar with the reporting mechanisms, the reporting processes for each platform that they used. So for the respondents who utilized the reporting mechanisms, they said that they use this because they'd been exposed to violent or inappropriate content. But one thing that was noted, and this was by one of the interview participants, Bridget, is that there is a distinct lack of specificity in platforms' reporting mechanisms. So I guess most of you are probably aware that the majority of platforms, they have these predetermined categories for reporting abuse. So this doesn't actually give the users much room or much of an option to fully articulate their experiences. And you can see in the screenshot there, Facebook's reporting options. So they've got, you have the option to select harassment, suicide or self-injury, pretending to be someone, sharing inappropriate things, hate speech, unauthorized sales, scams or other. But yeah, as Bridget mentioned, this is very kind of limited, and it does lack the option to give additional context too, which is, pretty essential when you're thinking about what repercussions are there and how does that match up with the actual experience. So this was the last of the protective strategies which emerged from my study. And it was probably, I guess, one of the most extreme measures. Like that was to go completely dark and withdraw from social media platforms altogether. And a lot of the interview participants explained that, or they believe that girls and young women are told to remove themselves from social media, and in some cases permanently delete their accounts as well. So, for example, Greta there at the top highlighted that these actions are often linked to victim blaming attitudes, and they punish victims for the harmful behaviors they've experienced. So she said, there's a lot of the victim just needs to leave the platform. That is what I hear that is used against people. It's like, why did you experience this? Why did you not leave? This is what the policies of the platforms are saying. You can just leave. And also Sophia recalled having conversations with girls and young women who are frequently told by parents, teachers, and other relatives to close their social media accounts if they experience abuse on digital platforms. But I guess this advice aligns with this digital dualist mindset that online and offline life is distinct and opposing. So, having it like, okay, well, you can easily just block it out and you won't experience it offline, but actually online and offline kind of merged in that sense when we're talking about the harms. So she explained, we spoke about this a lot. She's her talking about in her work, speaking to girls and young women who've experienced this abuse. Apparently they got extremely frustrated, especially people from older generations who are being like, well, if you don't like the harms or if you actually care about your privacy, then just get offline. So like I mentioned at the start of the presentation, when I talked about the just get offline quote, this narrative or this advice really does need to change. And I can offer some suggestions on how to do that. So in the last part of this presentation, I'm going to be drawing on a range of insights, reflections, and suggestions from the interviewees and the survey respondents. So this will help identify ways to develop the most appropriate responses for online gender-based violence. And I used their responses to kind of inform my thinking, and it made me realize that it should be multifaceted, this response, to tackle this issue. So it includes a combination of platform responses, some government intervention, educational and preventative measures, and bystander intervention strategies and legal responses. So I think we all know that social media platforms haven't really had the best reputation when it comes to addressing users' experiences of online abuse. And traditionally, these platforms have presented themselves as like neutral conduits, passive facilitators of communication. So they've used this framing to kind of diffuse their responsibility for the actions of perpetrators. And yeah, you can see here that Jasmine said, I think profit is what drives these companies rather than some kind of pure connection to the community. So there is some evidence where dating platforms, so Bumble, for example, has made some public moves to accept the responsibility for the safety and well-being of its users. But other platforms here, and I've suggested like Reddit, X, or Twitter, and YouTube, they haven't really done as much as they should to protect girls and young women, because it's not really part of the business model. They're not generating profit either. So that goes back to Jasmine's comment. And then there was something interesting that Bridget shared with me too. So like I mentioned before, that age group 18 to 25 is kind of a crucial point for understanding these experiences and how often these experiences happen to girls and young women in that age group. So Bridget was actually 23 when I conducted the interview. And she said that she was able to meet with Instagram and Twitter or X, TikTok, LinkedIn, and also the e-safety commissioner. And she was able to say to these companies, this is what we're experiencing. We've done this research. This is what was coming out of our research. And we wanted to develop these recommendations as to how these platforms should better respond. But what they found is the people on the committees, they weren't actually, they hadn't experienced this personally. So it was there was kind of, a lack of emotional connection and understanding about what girls and young women actually need and how social media platforms can better design their infrastructure, improve their infrastructure pretty much. Because it's not really a safe space right now. And there are, countless, as I guess I've offered that, countless ways that, girls and women don't feel safe online because they've experienced this kind of abuse. So I wanted to talk a little bit about government intervention, but I don't want to go in too much detail. But if we're talking about what's happening in Australia, I know in terms of government intervention, there's been the expansion of some content moderation efforts, Meta's oversight board, and there have been more publication of transparency reports at Facebook, X, and YouTube. But if we're talking about my study here, both the interview participants and survey respondents, they carefully identified the extent to which governments should moderate harmful content on social media. So, for example, you'll see that Julia believed that governments should just play a light role, a minor role in regulating this type of content. And she explained that there's a fine line between protecting people and playing Big Brother, meaning that governments should play a light role but not dominate over the companies who host these social media sites. So Julia is essentially highlighting the balance that exists between giving platforms the opportunity to self-regulate whilst also ensuring that they don't become spaces where girls and young women are subjected to pervasive and unmitigated abuse. And you'll see here, so survey respondent Isabella also shared these concerns, especially when talking about this potential bias in governments, which can closely mirror the personal bias from social media platforms. So she said that there's no point in the government restricting speech if it's to serve their own agenda and not to protect people from gender-based violence. So I thought that point was interesting and also kind of aligns with some of the other points that the interview participants and the survey respondents were saying, that government intervention alone will not be sufficient enough to challenge and address inequality and abuse experienced by girls and young women on social media, but instead governments should work alongside platforms to minimize behaviors of online gender-based violence. So really this should all be taken with a grain of salt. So some interview participants suggested that awareness raising campaigns could potentially be an effective way of reducing or preventing online gender-based violence. So for example, you'll see there, Carla recognized the value of these programs as they are designed to shift specifically men's perceptions and attitudes towards gender violence, as predominantly men are the perpetrators of online gender-based violence. So she said, in order to have some real change, we need to invest in programs that educate in a way that it's effective, and it's a long-term investment that changes the way young people, particularly young men, think about themselves in the world. So one of the, I guess, to compare to what the survey respondent said, so this is Amelia, she recommended that the Australian government should allocate resources towards early intervention and prevention programs, especially for primary school students. So there is the aim to address these concerns before they start engaging with social media platforms. So I know like there are age restrictions for how old you can be for when you sign up for a social media account, but I'm sure there are ways that people can access that. And, with technology expanding, I think it would be better. And based on these suggestions, to have that early intervention. So I guess these suggestions offer new ways of addressing emotional abuse, threats, sexual harassment, cyberstalking, basically all the types of behaviors that have emerged from my study. And then the end goal being to, create that effective and long-term solution to online gender-based violence. So this was an interesting one because the survey respondents didn't really bring up this approach, but the only experience was where a respondent said that their friend received a bunch of like nasty questions and comments on this platform called Ask FM. But they didn't actually specify if they did anything to intervene or if they did anything to help, like report or check in with the person or, or message the perpetrator, for example. But there were a few interviewees that spoke about how other users can empower girls and young women who experience OGBV online gender-based violence on social media. So this is a concept that Bridget Harris and Delaney Woodlock refer to as digital allies. So this actually involves transferring the burden of responsibility, which I mentioned before, transferring that to bystanders and allies, with a specific focus on men who are less likely than women to experience online gender-based violence, but they're more likely to be in a position where they can actually challenge these pervasive cultural norms. So you'll see there in the top quote, Frances highlighted the importance of creating a community of digital allies. And she said, if more of us stand up, then we might be able to, over time, change that narrative and eventually support a more gender-based internet. And also Tanya, she identified ways in which bystanders can be encouraged to intervene or respond online. But she was a bit skeptical on how this can transfer into the online environment or online context. So she pitched this question: how do you take behavior that you would do in a physical environment, whether it's saying something, calling it out, rolling your eyes, or walking away from the conversation? How does that translate into the online environment? So, of course, there are some complexities when applying offline bystander intervention models to online contexts, but overall, it seemed like the interview participants were still supportive of this approach, and that it does have potential to contribute to addressing online gender-based violence. So finally, legal responses. This was interesting. So they weren't really welcomed by the interview participants, especially, you can see at the top there. Greta said that she was a very strong prison abolitionist, and she doesn't hold much faith at all in the criminal justice system or policing systems that respond to this type of harm. So she believed that the legal regulation of online gender-based violence, that it can't actually address the underlying social and cultural norms of violence. And you'll see also in the bottom quote from Robin that there needs to be a greater focus on repairing the harm. And she doesn't believe that the criminal justice system can actually offer that. This is especially true when the rates of online harm are so low, like conviction rates, etc. That's not really a common thing that happens. But it is interesting to note that some of the survey respondents did speak about ways in which we could use legal responses, probably not as they are currently, but how they can be improved. So, for example, Molly believed that many acts of online harassment can be dealt with by legal means if they are severe enough. But here she seems to be referring to offline forms of harm that can be facilitated through online technology or social media, because she's talking about stalking and threats of violence. So it does raise some important questions about the adequacy of current legal frameworks and how these can address the nuances of online gender-based violence, and whether this is actually possible in the future. So what next? I guess that's a big question. I think we just need to keep challenging gendered violence, keep challenging sexism, misogyny, calling it out if we feel comfortable to do so, but also create these safe spaces for girls and young women in the first place. And I know I didn't talk about this in depth, but social media platforms and the internet more generally, it was never really designed with women in mind in the first place. These places were designed by men for men. And of course, it doesn't help that social media platforms are primarily driven by profit, because promoting online safety isn't really, like I mentioned, is not really part of the business model. But to not be so pessimistic, there is hope. There are things happening in this space. A bit more people are talking about online gender-based violence. I know the e-Safety Commission is doing a lot of work in Australia, so specifically in line with the Online Safety Act, which was released start of last year, and also the voluntary codes that aim to protect users from online harm. And yeah, like I said, people are starting to feel more comfortable in sharing their experiences, particularly as we're very dependent on technology these days. So the stuff that happens online is really just a reflection of the physical violence that's being perpetrated in the so-called real world. So if we just keep talking about this and listening also to what girls and young women actually need to feel safe on social media, then of course we can start developing some more holistic approaches to online gender-based violence that are also inclusive of their voices and their needs. So that's it from me today. Thank you again so much for having me. And yeah, looking forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and for a wonderful presentation, and Sarah, very insightful. Alexa is clapping you, and Saskia as well. Are there any questions? Perhaps, Hannah, while people are developing their questions, might you just talk a little bit more about the e-Safety Commissioner, because I've seen her on TV, on mainstream media, and they say the right, the Commission seems to say the right things, but I'm not sure that's really getting down. And as you also say, that online and offline are not very separate. And, we're up to about 58 women being murdered by partners just this year alone. And one of them, highlighting the education system as, especially with elite private schoolboys schools. I mean, so education is all very well, but what are your thoughts on that as well? I know it's a bit of a ramble, but if you could pick up perhaps on one or two of those.
Yeah, so I think obviously there's no silver bullet. Like I mentioned, it'll be kind of a multifaceted response if we're going to tackle these harms effectively. And yeah, I recognize the work of the e-Safety Commission. I think that quote that I shared, where I think it was one of the interview participants, she said that she went to the e-Safety Commissioner, but there seemed to be a disconnect between, okay, well, what are they actually experiencing, and what should be the measures to ensure that they're safe on social media. And yeah, she mentioned that a lot of people didn't actually have those direct experiences. So I think inviting more people, especially people from diverse or marginalized backgrounds as well. So to have that intersectional lens and inviting people from, different facets of society would be a way to ensure that people feel comfortable. They're not experiencing abuse to the extent that they are now. And also keeping up with the technology too, I think is really crucial, because there's always going to be new platforms that emerge and people finding new ways of perpetrating this type of abuse. So I think making sure that we're kind of upskilling that without putting I know it's hard to do without putting the onus on the victim, but yeah, making sure that there are those things in place. And I think if it is a combination of these efforts and people working together, rather than be like, okay, the e-Safety Commissioner can do everything, but realistically, you do need different sectors working together. And you do need the support from platforms too, because at the end of the day, it's going to be really hard to change these spaces and change their infrastructure as well. So I don't have a clear solution, but I want to kind of go back to the voices of participants and see what they actually need, because they're the ones that are experiencing it directly. So yeah.
And just before we commenced this morning, we were talking about criminology, and you come from more of a criminology than a sociological background. What are your experience? What are your thoughts on, let's call them the low level, like the state police forces and perhaps even the AFP? You hear stories about people or women going to their local police, their state police force, and basically getting told to go home.
Yeah. None of the survey respondents, they didn't report it to police. They knew that it was an option, but I think they kind of internalized it oh, it's not serious enough, or the police won't care, because they might have had previous experiences with the police where it's been okay, yeah, we're going to do something, but then like the conviction rate is so low anyway, and it just kind of re-traumatizes them in a way too. But in comparison, the interview participants who had that kind of expert knowledge, they did recognize some value, but not in the current state. They were like, no, we need to like upskill police or educate them and, you know, bring them on the journey with us so that we can use them in some way. But I personally, I'm not sure how that kind of translates and whether or not that'll actually be effective. Sure, I mean, more education would work, but it's difficult to change that mindset and to actually be believed. You know, people aren't believed for like physical sexual harassment. So can you imagine like online harassment as well? It's like, oh, okay, going back to the thing, just delete them or just block them, or just don't use social media. Yeah.
Sure. Really great presentation, Hannah. Thank you so much. You mentioned in your presentation that part of the problem is like when these platforms were being created, they weren't being created with women in mind. They're coming from that place of being created for men. You know, the history of Facebook is such a stark example of that. What would it look like if a social media platform was created by women and for women? What would that look like? How would that be different?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This is something I didn't talk about, I just didn't have time, but there is good work being done in like the feminist principles of the internet. So I'm happy to share with anyone if they're interested. But basically, I think we probably need to rebuild these social media platforms if we are to make these safe spaces for girls and young women. Obviously, a lot of, like you mentioned, Saskia, like Facebook started from obviously like the hot or not kind of thing. So seeing like basically using women's appearance to judge whether or not they're worthy, or like it's based on, you know, how they look pretty much, which is obviously very misogynistic. And so I think, tearing that down and having recognizing that this is also like one of my theories, which I didn't touch on, but techno-feminism, which is basically like women don't feel welcome, or they're like passive, or they're technologically incompetent. So trying to identify where these attitudes are coming from, they're obviously very harmful. And I know, like, for example, I mentioned Bumble. That is probably, if we're going to say the best example, I would use Bumble as like a best case scenario where, you know, this was built on the women having the choice to, you know, message someone first. And, you know, I mentioned that there are things in place to ensure the safety of users as well. So if we kind of, I guess, if we adapt that kind of attitude and kind of expand this more, then potentially there could be better spaces. But at this stage, I think it doesn't look super promising, but that's just my opinion.
Thanks, Hannah. That's really insightful. Thank you.
Thanks.